So if anybody wants to move up here, there's still some seats. It's always nice. I always like to be in the front, but come on up here. There's still some good seats here. So now the focus is on hearing and noise. And we have learned about hearing and noise from a number of areas. And I guess so many things to say. And I think one of them, the audiologist who is working very hard over there and making a beautiful drawing, you said something at the end of my talk that I think is a very interesting one. So as an audiologist who works with hearing impaired children, and she is regularly using music in her practice. And the way that the audiologists, the other people kind of look at what she's doing, they say, oh, isn't that nice? The kids like it. It's just, it's fun, right? But they don't think of it in terms of, well, this is actually improving sound processing for this child. And moreover, as again you pointed out, that someone who plays music, the idea of ear and brain training is a completely natural one. And yet, if somebody who is musically inclined needs a hearing aid, they may not be thinking about so many of the things that you ordinarily know about your field. And so, and again, jumping off on what you were talking about with technology, technology can take us only so far. We need to be able to think, and we need to be able to integrate. And there are only enough facts that, in fact, we have too many facts often. And also when the technology doesn't work, what were we going to do if Arthur hadn't come up to help you when we weren't getting the sound system to work? Well, we have great technology, but we wouldn't have been able to make much use of it. And somebody was telling me about her automatic lawnmower before that wasn't working especially well. So, we need to be able to know how things work. We need to be able to think. I want to recommend a book, because, again, you inspired me to recommend books. It's called The Master and His Emissary. It is a book about the divided brain, the right and the left sides of the brain, which is a title that I would automatically keep away from, because there's just been so much junk written about the ideas of the two sides of the brain. But in fact, he really makes some very excellent points economically, socially, politically, about wanting to understand all of the component parts, having all the bits of data, and then what is really needed in order to connect that data with another person, with the world. And that connection really needs a human. His name is Ian McGilchrist. And if you just want to dip your toe into it, one of my favorite podcasts is Econ Talk. And he was interviewed on that. And so that's just an hour to listen to. If you read his book, it's a very slow-going, dense book, but I'm about halfway through it. It's very much worth my while and really speaks to a lot of the issues that we're talking about today in our technological world. Okay, so hearing and noise. So we have insights, and we've gained insights from a number of different fields, because hearing and noise is such a natural part of our everyday life. So, what do we know about how the brain handles noise exposure? What about hearing loss? What about aging? Concussion? You're wondering, what is she talking about? auditory enrichment, and deprivation. So I'm going to touch on all of these subjects, and you're going to, again, be convinced, I think, how pervasive sound is in our lives, what an important force sound processing is in making us human, and how so many different aspects of our lives can come together through sound. So we can think of sound as our invisible ally and enemy. So first of all, sound processing in the brain, I want to put to you, reflects the past, so our past experience, and can predict the future. So it's a kind of, if I measure sound processing in your brains right now, it's a kind of fortune telling. And I want to say that the sounds of our lives shape our brains. So if we think of musical experience or speaking another language, these are allies for sound processing in the brain. Whereas noise, hearing loss, getting hit in the head, these disrupt sound processing in the brain. So, we think that the ingredients that we put into our body are important, and in many ways we are what we eat, and we also are what we hear. We really are. Think about that. Don't be cavalier about the sounds in your lives, the meaningful and the non-meaningful ones. So we know that there are certain ingredients in foods that are good for us and good for certain parts of our bodies. And we know that, again, certain experiences are good for sound processing in the brain, and other experiences are not. So I love to talk to a group like this about signals, because you live in the world of signals, and really it is marvelous to be able to take very complex issues in our lives, like hearing and noise and aging, the effects of musical experience, bilingualism, and to think about them in terms of signals, because signals lend a certain objectivity to very, very abstract and complex processes. And so there are signals outside the head and inside the head, and these are very, very quantifiable, and they're beautiful in their objectivity, and they give us a tremendous handle and strength to be able to deal with human issues, intangible issues. So in terms of what's going on in the brain, I can tell you that through many years, we really worked towards figuring out a good metric for looking at sound processing. And we don't do this to the exclusion of other measures. We measure otoacoustic emissions, we measure all kinds of slower physiologic potentials, we do brain imaging, but we really find that the frequency following response for an audience like you, for people who deal with individual people, you can get a tremendous amount of information about sound processing that I hope will become a standard of care. So these are a couple of sources that I would suggest you take a look at if you're interested in the topic. And just to go over for a second what I spoke about earlier, the idea that a sound wave and a brain wave can actually physically resemble one another. And this is another funky music. It's just the beginning clip, and you can hear the Rhodes piano and then the brain. Oh, except I need to. So that was the brain. And And so, the idea that we have so much to work with, and again, this is just an important concept that I'm just reviewing, the idea that out of a single brain response, we can get many, many ingredients of sound processing: pitch, timing, timbre, phase, stability, and we can see how good a job the brain is doing at measuring these responses. Okay, you know what pitch, timing, and timbre are. But here are just a couple of other examples that I just want to play. Here's a sound wave and a brain wave. And I just got to play you this one again because it's my favorite. But it's really fun and informative to not only be able to see the responses from the nervous system, but to be able to hear them. Do you remember was this a big deal over here in Norway, this Yanni Laurel business? So it's interesting because, again, the FFR can give us information about this. Everybody was wondering, what a mystery. Oh my God, I heard it. Oh, I heard. And if you have an ambiguous signal, the way that your speaker and that your brain is used to processing certain elements and not others is going to influence how you hear the sound. And my former graduate student and professor now, Gabriela Musacchia, recorded FFRs, and she found that the people who heard Yanni had the aspects of the acoustic aspects of that sound more pronounced, and the people who heard Laurel heard aspects of the sound that were more in a line with that. And it's just, these are just people taken off the street, but they had distinctive brain responses, as you might expect. And, this was similar to, where's the guy who asked me the question earlier about individual instruments? Did he split? Where did he was sitting right there. Anyway, what we know is that whereas any instrument that you play is going to change how sound is processed in your brain, your own instrument is going to have a particular place in your neural processing heart because of the particular sensitivity that you have to that instrument. So for example, vocalists are very good at certain aspects of sound processing. And drummers are especially good at certain timing aspects of sound processing. But this is what I really want to show you, is that each one of us has a neural signature. So if I take the same speech sound and I play it for you, and we have been using da a lot because it's a sound across many languages. It has a lot of acoustic complexities, consonants, vowels, and this is from the same person, recorded at over a year or two, or three. And this is another individual. And there are certain aspects of the response that are common to everyone, but you can see that people really do have a particular signature, just like we all have a nose and our eyebrows and however we may be. We're going to kind of continue to look sort of the same year after year. And so to be able to look at changes in a person's responses over time can give you a lot to work with. You're not just looking at big patterns over cross-sectional groups of people. This is the brain keyboard. So This is electricity from the brain. And if I had more time, I actually have a keyboard where we have measured the brain's response from every single note of the 3-octave keyboard. And then we can play the keyboard and basically play, if I measured your brain's response or your brain's response, and we can hear different brains. And what is very nice about that, first of all, it's this intersection. It's where art meets science. But again, it gives us a lot to work with. And I just want to play for you some of these clips that you heard a little bit before, but you're going to hear, these are 3 healthy brains. So these are just 3 people who you might see in your clinics, but I want you to hear how different these normal brains sound. So, clearly the acoustic characteristics of the melody is being carried, but there is more and less fidelity difference. Have a listen to this one. This is one brain. Here's another brain. So use your imaginations now. Just think, you have 3 clients in your practice, and they have brains. They all have presbycusic hearing loss. They're identical as far as their audiograms go, but their brains are going to sound different. And largely they're going to sound different because of their life in sound. And it is up to you to figure out the very best amplification for that person. So, I like to really think about the fact that our lives in sound reflect the past and predict the future, and that really what we can do with measuring sound processing in the brain is a form of time travel. So let's talk about noise. And the kind of noise that I want to talk about is not the one that you're all familiar with. Yeah, you all know that loud sounds are going to give you a hearing loss. I'm not talking about the kinds of noises that are going to give you a shift in threshold. We're not even talking about the audiogram here. We're talking about the everyday sounds. How many of us spend a lot of time in airplanes or use a hairdryer? These are sounds that will not give you a hearing loss, but will influence your sound processing in the brain. So how you're able to make sense of sound, and whether your brain is going to sound like the first guy, the second guy, or the third guy I played. So if you have something like music, it's a very patterned sound, whereas noise often does not have very much of a pattern, or if it has a pattern, it's very constant and unchanging, and the brain likes both patterns and change. Here's another just fun illustration of noise. But noise comes from nausea. It means seasickness in Latin. It also means quarreling in Middle English. And these are many examples, and you can come up with many, many others, of so-called safe sounds. These are not sounds that are typically going to give you an elevated hearing threshold, but are going to influence your health. And if you live in New York, every time I visit, I have 2 of my 3 sons live in New York, and we spend a lot of time in the subways. And I wonder, am I the only one who's wearing ear protection? You know, I go, I hear the fireworks. I love the fireworks. I wear ear protection. So noise has an effect on health in that it affects our stress, our cardiovascular health, our learning outcomes, memory, quality of life, and it gets in the way of our doing challenging tasks well. And even just from an ear standpoint, I mean, the vasculature of the ear is very, very minuscule and precise, and stress and cardiovascular stress is not good for either the ear or the brain. So if you look at these measures from the World Health Organization, if you look at years of lost work, sleep disturbance is one of the biggest causes. Noise annoyance. And so these two things are way up there, and often sleep disturbance is caused, at least in part, by noise difficulty. So again, you know, when I travel now, you know, I just stick earplugs in my ears, because you never know when the guy next door to you in your hotel is going to, you know, have a yappy dog or, you know, make a lot of noise. This is a very interesting study that was done on third graders, where they took third graders who were educated in the same school, but some of them had a classroom that was overlooking a field, and another had a classroom that was overlooking a highway. And they did very nice controlled studies, you know, controlling for the teachers and this and that. And they really were able to demonstrate that the kids who had just the constant roar of the highway performed less well across the board on all kinds of academic measures. And again, you know, because sound is invisible, we are very cavalier about it. I mean, just let's listen. You know, if we took out our little dB meters, this would read something. And how many times have you been, I don't know, in your kitchen, and the refrigerator turns off? And what is your reaction? What is your reaction? Right? Doesn't that tell us something? Yeah? So we know that noise can damage the ear, and we know about hidden hearing loss, and this is real damage to the ear that is generally brought about by higher intensity sounds. But again, I want to focus on so-called safe level sounds. So this is work that Jos Egermont has done, and the Merznick group as well, in cats primarily. And so, as you know, our auditory system throughout the auditory pathway, beginning with the ear, through the midbrain, through the cortex, has a very organized tonotopic organization. Well, they found that if you took especially developing animals and subjected them to moderate level sounds for a number of hours a day, what happened is that this tonotopic organization became disrupted. Now, this is interesting. I don't know if this is something that people use over here in Norway, but in the States, more and more parents are using these white noise machines to keep their babies asleep at night. Because you know, if you live in an apartment, or you know, there are other children running around, they think if they put a white noise generator next to the baby's crib, that's going to it's not going to make the baby wake up every time somebody slams a door. Well, this has real consequences for brain health. I mean, imagine a child cannot help but make sense of sound. A child, you know, put them in, I mean, if I were a child already, just being here a couple of days, I'd have way more Norwegian than I do. Because as a child, you're looking for patterns. And now you're thrown into, you're sleeping many hours a night, and your brain is trying to make sense of this meaningless sound. And it ends up disorganizing the developing auditory system. People don't think about this. Again, if we look in the auditory midbrain, we see that moderate level of exposure of noise, and this is 1 hour, 2 hours, just increases the amount of background neural noise in midbrain neurons. So if you have a lot of neural activity, it's going to impede your ability to pull out any signal that you want out of that noise. This is another very great example of out of Egermann's work, where here animals were exposed to tones at this frequency, and this is the control animal, and what you can see is that the response to that frequency just became disrupted because of the exposure to that particular frequency. Does that make sense with me? We also know, again, these are all from very controlled experimental animal studies, that animals' ability to tell the difference between different sounds, and so these animals do not have a hearing loss, they have completely normal ABR thresholds, and yet their ability to discriminate some of these sounds is poor, because they have been listening to safe level sounds for a number of hours a day. Okay? So our noisy environments, and we have to just ask ourselves this question of, where are we living? Where are we spending our lives? What kinds of sounds are we listening to on a regular basis? So hearing a noise has a very particular signature of sound processing in the brain. One of the aspects of sound processing that people who are good at hearing speech and noise process well is the fundamental frequency. So the fundamental frequency gives us a lot of pitch cues. It tells us a lot about auditory objects, who's speaking, what is the sound of that helicopter, it'll have a pitch. And so these aspects of auditory object formation are very important for hearing a noise. And again, we can just objectively measure the FFR in people, and it turns out that people who are good at hearing speech and noise in a speech and noise test like HINT or Quicksin are going to also have strong fundamental frequencies. And there's a nice relationship between hearing a noise ability and the strength of the fundamental frequency. We also, so remember I said that the FFR looks so much like the stimulus that produces it, that a stimulus to response correlation is a meaningful measure. So, again, this is entirely objective. You're just doing a correlation. It's going to be a number from 0 to 1. And it turns out that the better your timing is, your stimulus to response correlation, the better you're hearing a noise. So the timing in the brain very much matters and is an ingredient and a factor that you can utilize in understanding your patient's ability to hear a noise or not. And this is something that you might want to look at and think about when you have a product, when you have a hearing aid or a hearing aid setting. Is this something that is going to improve my stimulus to response correlation? That is likely to improve their hearing and noise ability. So, and we know that better hearing and noise tracks with with cognitive skills. And so these are very, very important. Again, in counseling people, it is as important to counsel people about not spending time in needlessly noisy environments, about spending time doing auditory tasks that stimulate their working memory, because that's going to help them in understanding speech and noise. And we know that musicians as a whole lead noisy lives. This is work that Erica Skoy, one of my former students who's now a professor at University of Connecticut, she had, I mean, the best way of measuring noise exposure is to have people wear dosimeters. So she had the music students and non-music students just wear dosimeters for a number of weeks. And she found that even if you took away the time that the music students were playing music, just in general, they liked a lot of sound. And so they seemed to actually be living noisier lives. That's interesting. Also, what is important is that if you like the sound that you're listening to, you are less likely to be bothered by it, but even that if you're measuring a threshold shift of a loud sound, if the sound is perceived as a pleasure, you are less likely to experience a loss in hearing temporarily than if it is a punishment. So, for example, what they have done is taken students and put some students in a dark, smelly room and they've been told that they're just doing a bad job at everything, and everyone's annoyed at them, and they hear, meanwhile, these sounds in the background, and then they have other students who are put in the same room, but now it's bright and sunny, and they're being told what a good job they're doing and how nice they look, and the same sound is going on in the background, and lo and behold, it is how you feel about the sound really influences then your perception of the sound afterwards. And we know of many classical musicians spend so many hours practicing, often music that they don't especially like because they're session musicians or they're being told what music to play. And I guess happens with any kind of musician. But even if you're playing music, it matters how you feel about it in terms of what it's going to do to your entire hearing system. So how do animals deal with noise? This is just fascinating. So, our little birdies out there, when they are listening to the sounds of the highway, for example, birdies, they need to be able to communicate in order to eat, to make their nests, to make their babies. And what people have found is that the birds will adjust the sounds of their voice so that they can be heard over the traffic noise. And there's an analysis of the frequency of the traffic noise so that you can see that they're making adjustments to be able to be heard over those particular aspects of sound. And what is even more fascinating is that on weekends, when there's less traffic, they revert back to their regular song, but during the week, when there's more traffic, they make these adjustments in their songs. So these are just fascinating studies that I suggest you have a peek at. Right? So sound is invisible. And without our knowing, our nervous system is, it is a very malleable system, thank goodness. And it is changing for better and worse I mean, just like these sparrows, we do what we need to do in order to be able to go on and to be as effective in our lives as we can be. So yeah, and whales, they will scream, they will make louder and louder sounds over the noise pollution of vibrations, underwater vibrations, until it gets to a certain point. And then when it gets this loud, they stop even vocalizing. They just give up. So I want to talk about hearing and noise, and I want to compare and contrast the bilingual, the musician, and the concussed athlete. So here they are, musician, you're bilingual, and your athlete. So we know that hearing and noise relies on cognition, attention, and working memory, and on sound processing in the brain. So let's talk about music and hearing and noise, and we've talked about this a little bit earlier, but I want to go back to a certain couple of points. So here are the three bops, and what they are doing is they are listening to the sound of their own instrument, because that's what we do as musicians. We will listen to the sound of our own instrument. And when we first took on this work many years ago, I really asked, I said, well, look, musicians are pretty good at making sense of complex soundscapes. Is it the case that they would be better than a non-musician at making sense of speech when it's a complex soundscape? And the answer really is yes. And so, first of all, we know that across the board, there are advantages in auditory working memory with musicians. But importantly, now there have been many, many, many studies. There have been a couple that have had equivocal and conflicting results. But most of them, the converging evidence, is showing again and again that people with musical experience have better hearing and noise. And again, here are some more studies. This was some longitudinal work that we did looking at second graders who had music, and after a year there was no difference in their hearing and noise ability from second grade to third grade. But from third to fourth grade, now this functional difference in their ability to make sense of sound and noise improved. Now, I really want to show you this in terms of what is going on in the brain. Because if you take a response to a speech sound over here, and here it is in quiet, the musicians and the non-musicians have a very similar response to sound. But if you now put the sound in noise, this is where the difference is. Once it gets tricky, it is where the musician's response stays almost as good in noise as it is in quiet, but the non-musician response really takes a hit, right? And again, if we look at timing, in quiet, the timing is pretty good for both the musician and the non-musician, but the non-musician becomes more timing delayed in their brain's response to sound compared to the musician. Okay, and we could just see this objectively. There's no judgment to be made. This is work from the Beitelman lab, and again, we know that an aspect of noise.
Many factors influence speech intelligibility.
So reverberation is an issue, right? And everybody does worse picking out sentences in increased reverberation, but people with musical experience do better across the board. And again, you can see that their representation of sound processing, especially as it gets rougher, is better objectively in the brains of the musicians. But now this is interesting, okay? And again, this is a paper that is just coming out in Ear and Hearing, so look out for it. This again is my former student who is interested in this idea of musical training and speech and noise. And in fact, she also replicated, again, that musicians, people with musical experience, are better at hearing speech and noise. But remember, she was the one who had people walk around with dosimeters. And so she found that people with musical training are also likely to have more noise exposure than people who do not have musical training. So she did some beautiful modeling, and she was really able to show how the musician advantage in hearing a noise is mitigated by the amount of noise exposure that a person has. So, you know, we have to think. This is important information, and it's very practical information to take with us, shown biologically, into our daily lives. We know that hearing loss will accelerate cognitive aging. Surely playing music can help offset this. Again, there's a lot of data showing us this, as well as bilingualism. But I want to show you this. You're going to find this interesting. So here is hearing a noise. These is both. We saw this with Quickson and Hint. You can see that the non-musicians are performing worse. And here are the musicians, age-matched. These are all older adults. And here is a musician with a hearing loss. And you can see that it's a typical presbycusic hearing loss. So here's a musician with a hearing loss who is hearing better than this non-musician who has normal hearing thresholds. So I cannot tell you more loudly and clearly what I'm sure you already know, that if you can take two people with very identical audiograms and they will have a different life experience in sound. So yes, of course the audiogram matters, hearing loss matters, but what matters also, to an enormous extent, is how people are using their hearing and how people are using the remaining hearing that they have. And you have a role in maximizing this. So again, if we look at auditory working memory, we see that here are the non-musicians, the musicians, and here are the musicians with hearing loss who are still excelling in auditory working memory compared to the normal hearing non-musicians. These are hot off the press here. We just got these data on older adults. We were looking at speech and noise. And you know, what we know is that as the signal to noise ratio becomes more difficult, there is a drop in the ability to hear accurately speech and noise, right? And this is at super threshold. Now, if you look at older adults, this happens even at less favorable hearing and noise levels. You can see that the hearing and the older adults are doing better than the young adults, okay? Now, again, if we look at the older musicians, where do you think that they're going to lie? Come on, guys. Better than what? Better than both? Wow. That's the data. I like your optimism. Now, if you look at variability, again, because this is a very important measure in hearing a noise, how sure are you? What is your standard deviation of performance? Again, we can see that here are young adults, and you know very well that older adults are hugely variable in their ability to do a lot of different auditory tasks. And the older adult musicians are right up here. So this is what I had shown earlier, and I just really want you to see this audiogram, the Holy audiogram. Here are the musicians with hearing loss, and if you look at their FFRs, you can see, well, here is the non-musician. The blue line is the fundamental frequency in quiet, and in noise, this non-musician who has completely normal hearing thresholds is not doing very well here in terms of the fundamental frequency. And here is the musician who has very good fundamental frequency in both quiet and noise, and basically this guy does not do well in noise, and this guy has a much better hearing and noise performance. Okay, so all of you are bilinguals, right? And it's important. And so bilinguals have certain advantages. One of the advantages is in attention, in that, because a bilingual always has two languages that are working at the same time, you have to be able to know what to pay attention to. And so, you can think of it as, having different windows on your computer screen up at the same time. You're only attending to one of them, but you still have multiple windows up, right? These are all your different languages. And I have to tell you, I don't know if you have this experience, but, with Italian, for me, if I'm speaking to someone who is fluent in English and in Italian, it is the most relaxing experience ever, because I know that whatever words or phrases or sentiments that I want to be saying, I can just express them so easily in one or the other language. I can just go back and forth, and I don't have to just stay with the one language. So there is something about the bilingual brain. So bilinguals have an advantage when it comes to hearing signals and noise, certain signals and noise. So, tones that are simultaneously masked or backward masked, and sounds, various sound sequences that have no linguistic content. That's a little herald. So the bilingual neural signature is one where, not surprisingly, the neural signature, you have this strength of the fundamental frequency, which you can see. The red guy is the bilingual. And again, we see this in children, adults, and younger adults, adolescents and young adults. This varies as a function of years of multilingual experience, so how strong your bilingualism is. And again, look at the hearing and noise. So here is hearing and noise in quiet and noise for your bilinguals. And here is your monolinguals, and you can see that, first of all, even in quiet, your bilinguals are doing better, but the difference becomes even larger in noise. So there is a certain noise resistance that comes from being bilingual. And bilingual responses are more stable. So if you look at trial by trial stability of the response, if I measure one response and then another response, another response, another response, and then I correlate one response to another, how how much jitter is there, or how much correlation is there? And again, we see that bilingual responses are more stable. So you have this advantage in selective attention for bilinguals, in both auditory and visual selective attention. And you have the strength of the fundamental frequency, which varies as a function of auditory selective attention ability, okay? And response stability also varies as a function of auditory selective attention ability. And there is not this relationship in the monolingual. So it would appear that the bilinguals have this relationship between the strength of the fundamental frequency and their ability to pay attention to auditory objects. So here's the bilingual signature, where you have strength of the fundamental frequency, you have a more stable response, and you have noise resistance. And remember before, I talked about linguistic deprivation. And this is something that you often see with low-income families. And what is really interesting is that this neural stability it's an aspect of linguistic deprivation. And if you can take bilinguals who are in the same socioeconomic condition, and also if you compare maternal education, if you are bilingual and if you're coming from a bilingual family, you are more likely to have a more stable response, which can, again, partially offset the disadvantage of having been brought up in a household where not a lot of speaking was happening. So this neural stability tracks with language. And again, different from the musician. So here we have, I showed you before, this signature of linguistic deprivation, where you have decreased stability and decreased harmonics. Well, what the bilingual does is you have this increased stability, whereas the musician increases the harmonics, you see? And so it's really kind of interesting that, and I'm going to compare and contrast the bilinguals and the musicians in a minute, because it's kind of cool. But here's some food for thought. So bilinguals have an enhanced fundamental frequency. We know that the fundamental frequency tracks with hearing, speech, and noise. But bilinguals are actually poorer at hearing speech in noise. Why is that? This makes a lot of sense. So here are some data showing that bilinguals are, in fact, worse than monolinguals at hearing speech and noise. And that is because hearing and noise is impacted by knowing two languages. You have a smaller phonetic inventory in each language, and you have some rival lexical alternatives. So there are some challenges. And we know that hearing and noise is impacted by how much vocabulary you know in the language that the hearing and noise test was made in. So, also the extent of bilingualism matters. So if you learned your second language later in life, you're going to have more difficulty hearing speech and noise. So taken together, there is this trade-off. So remember, I told you that the bilinguals were better at hearing speech and noise when you were looking at tones. But this gets reversed when you're looking at speech and noise because of the linguistic complexity, the linguistic confounds. So, again, this is important information to know when you're thinking about who do you have in front of you and what is their proficiency and what languages. So here you have an advantage, here you have a disadvantage. So I like to compare and contrast the neural signatures of the bilinguals and the musicians. So, with the bilinguals, you have the strength in the fundamental frequency and in the stability of the response, and the musicians have a strength in harmonics and in timing. And many of the aspects of sound processing that the bilinguals are strong at are aspects of sound that are occurring more slowly than some of the very rapid microsecond processing of sound that the musicians are really, really good at. And again, so bilinguals are especially good at attention skills, and musicians are especially good at memory skills. So you have these dissociable signatures, which is rather interesting. So, if you're both a musician and bilingual, you have a lot going for you, right? But again, the fact that this can be so dissociable tells us so clearly that sound processing in the brain is incredibly complicated. And if we look at the processing of the fundamental frequency or the processing of the harmonics or how stable your response is, these all invoke different kinds of neural calculations, because our auditory system is so complex, so that you can't just just turn the sound, make it louder. You have to be considering the acoustical complexity and the different bottlenecks and strengths that your client has and that you as individuals have. But interestingly, both bilinguals and musicians have a strength in being more resistant to noise. Okay? So their biological responses in noise are stronger. I'm going to skip over this. All right, I'm going to jump to concussion. Now, this is, I think, fascinating, because sound processing in the brain is one of the most complex jobs that we ask our brain to do. I really want you to think about sound processing in the brain as a measure of brain health. So you have to make computations on the order of microseconds. This is faster than neurons fire for you to be able to make these computations to make sense of sound. So if you get hit in the head, it is very likely that this complex machinery is going to be disrupted. At least that's what we thought, and others have thought this, and now there is some good evidence, again, converging evidence. So there is a history, and you know from your VA studies that soldiers who've had blast injuries have complained of difficulty and have demonstrated inordinate difficulty hearing a noise, even controlling for the audiogram. And there have been some studies looking at hearing a noise in concussed athletes. Well, I want to tell you about one of the studies that we recently published. These are kids who were taken from a sports medicine clinic. And these are kids who continued to have concussion symptoms a week after they had had the concussion, so they were coming to this clinic. Our controls were age and sex matched kids from the same clinic who were there for musculoskeletal injuries, ankles and knees and things. And we gave them hearing and noise tests. We had them do the hint test. And you can see that the kids with a concussion performed worse than the control kids. And what we can see also is that, so these are the control kids, and as it takes a little while to go through all those sentences with the hint. And over time, the control kids, their performance remained very stable. If anything, they got a little bit better. But the kids who had sustained a concussion, they got worse, just even over the couple of minutes of the test session, indicating a certain fatigue in processing these sounds and noise. And think how important it is for an athlete to be able to process sound and noise. And there is such a high incidence of athletes who sustain a concussion sustaining a second concussion. Why is this? Because they are returned to play before their brain is ready. If you are a sports player, you have to be listening to the sound of your equipment, of your feet, of your players, of your coach talking to you, of the people out in the stands. There's a lot of auditory information, lots of sound you need to make sense of. And if you're not doing a very good job making sense of sound, you're going to be more vulnerable. So we now know that concussion disrupts the hearing brain, and this is what we have done here. We've really developed what we can call a biological marker through the FFR for concussion, and it identifies 95%, so it clears 95% of people who have no concussion, and 90% of kids who had a concussion yielded a positive response, which in clinical tests is not so bad. I want now you to hear, this is the Amazing Grace you've heard, this is the third time, but I want you to hear just a typical normal brain, and then a brain, and this is even some time out after a concussion, but someone who has sustained a concussion. So could you hear that there was an appreciable difference in the fidelity with which the sound was being carried by the brain? Sorry. So how can we use sound science to better impact health of people who have had a concussion, for example? So if we can have an objective measure of hearing health to help in the diagnosis, in deciding whether an athlete is ready to return to play or return to the classroom, return to learn, and to be able to arbitrate among different treatment options. So, again, there are many different options for so many aspects of hearing health, whether it's concussions, whether it's something that I haven't talked about but that came up at lunch, is the idea of computer games to strengthen your hearing ability after you've gotten a hearing aid, for example. And again, we have done studies, others have done studies really showing that these, if you exercise certain aspects of sound to meaning relationships, you will change sound processing in the brain in practical and in objective terms. So just taking a little closer look at these athletes. So we know that there is a relationship that people who have concussion have a difficulty with hearing and noise. And we also know that there is a relationship between hearing and noise and the frequency following response. And so we were asking about this relationship, and here are some of the kids that we have been testing. So these are the kids in the sports medicine clinic. We have a youth football league that we have been, and by football, this is American football. These are our Northwestern football players that we have been following for the last 2 years. They're adorable. Also some professional athletes. So after a post-concussion syndrome, what we see is that the stimulus to response correlations are worse. And we also, so timing is worse. And we also see that the strength of the fundamental frequency is reduced and comes back up following recovery. So it's a way that you can actually monitor health. And so again, really think more broadly. Think about your hearing as a measure of brain health. What is interesting is how nicely the strength of the FFR tracks with symptom severity in people who have sustained a concussion. So just to give you a sense of what the data are looking like, in athletes who have just sustained a concussion, so within 24, 48 hours of having a concussion, we see abnormalities across the board pervasively in pitch, timing, and timbre of processing of sound. Remember I said that most concussions resolve after a week, but in the ones in whom the symptoms continue, we continue to see deficits in the processing of pitch, so that's the fundamental frequency and various timing cues. And there are some individuals who are clear to play and who seem to be healthy otherwise, but we can still continue to see a legacy of their previous concussion history. Yes?
Forever, or?
We don't know forever. This is, what we have been testing so far is maybe a year or two out, yeah. And this is just in some people, it's not in everybody. So, and concussion is very complicated also in that depending on the sports that is being played, people can get, they may not get a full concussion, but they have many, many subconcussive injuries. So their brains are being jostled constantly. And, we're wanting to learn what is the impact of that. And so one of the things that we're doing, we have ongoing studies studying athletes of various ages. And importantly, so we just secured a grant from the National Institutes of Health to follow all of our 500 athletes at Northwestern University. As I mentioned, we've been following the football players for the past 2 years, and now we are following all of the athletes, males and females, in high and low impact sports. So we'll really get a sense of what is happening, again, so importantly, over time in the same athlete, and be able to answer your question, I think, much better. And I'm kind of brought here, it's funny, the idea of physical activity and musical activity has a personal resonance for me. So this is a picture of my Uncle Hans. And Uncle Hans was he was in physical medicine, and he was on the Council of Physical Fitness when President Kennedy was president, and many of the ideas that they had together died with the president, although he did establish a number of programs. But so much of his ideas are ideas that are very similar to what we're facing with music and with just thinking of our lives and sound in a healthy society. His point was that the way that athletes get physical education, at least in our school, I don't know how it is in Norway, but in our school, only the kids who make varsity and who are really the good team athletes, those are the ones that get the good coaching. The regular kid, doesn't really get very much attention in terms of physical education. And yet every child should be strong, every child should be flexible. And similarly, again, we can compare and contrast music education in the United States and in Norway, but in the United States, again, in schools, only the kids who really show an interest and who join the band and the orchestra, they will get some good coaching in their instrument. They'll get a decent musical education, but really being able to be musically literate and to be, it's a way of interacting with the world that I think is important for every child and not just for people who are going to become professional musicians. Because as we can see, experience with music early in life has lifelong impact when you're 70, 80 years old and you're wanting to hear your grandbabies in noise. So, yes, we're doing this ongoing work, and I just want to end with so from a technology standpoint, does anybody know who this guy is? This is Hugh Knowles, and he is the founder of Knowles Electronics, and I happen to be the Hugh Knowles chair and recently read this book, which is a fabulous read. I really recommend it to anybody who's interested in hearing. It gives you a lot of information about the hearing healthcare world. But he developed microphones that were so tiny that he was the one who began, in many ways, the hearing aid industry, because the microphones that he discovered, these were microphones that they took to the moon. And they were microphones that were so tiny that you could now envision making a hearing aid. But so now we have all kinds of technologies, and so you have this hearing aid, and this guy is saying, okay, these hearing aids aren't working so well anymore, and this one I like better. And these are real data. But the idea, I want to put in your heads, the idea of being able to inform your patient care with objective data. And sometimes a person is just not able to tell you, I like this one more, or that one more, this setting more, or that setting. But if you can see, oh, look at that, neural timing in noise is so much better with this setting than with that one. I know which one I'd like to try. And then also monitoring people over time, because as they get used to the hearing aid, their brain is going to change, and you're going to want to have that information. So this is Samira Anderson, who is a former student who is now a professor, tenured professor at the University of Maryland. And she has really been focusing on hearing aids and using the FFR and other brain potentials to inform fitting and hearing aid design. And so here you can see an unaided response, and here you can see an aided response. And I mean, you can just very easily see the response of the brain of this superthreshold stimulus. And in order to get these responses, in order to get frequency following responses, you have to have neural synchrony. Because you're probably familiar with auditory neuropathy, which is an absence of neural synchrony. So you get no ABR, you basically have no neural synchrony, and people, even who have auditory neuropathy and have normal hearing thresholds, are pretty much deaf in noise. You need synchrony for hearing and noise, and here's a way of picking up that synchrony and arbitrating across different devices. These are some of the products and some of the things that I use. I mean, I always use ear protection with music, with different filters, the fitted etymotic filters. How many of you are familiar with these? This is just wax, and I used it last night. What is wonderful is, like, for me, I have an ear canal, and you'll understand me. I have one of those ear canals that goes all in and around, and your basic earbud won't stay in for more than a second. I move and it's gone. But this wax is, like wax does, it molds when it gets warm to the shape that you make it, and so it stays in. It's beautiful. It's great. What I have been using a lot these days are these in-ear monitors. Fabulous. So I get wonderful sound either through Bluetooth or directly through a cable. And this is molded to my ear so that it is occluding the sound that I don't want to be hearing, like if I'm on the subway, if I'm on an airplane, but I can listen to my book, my podcast, my music, and it has changed my life. These are the kinds of things that knowing about what sound processing does to the brain and how important these choices that we make in our lives. I mean, you know much more about these products than I do, but it really, it is, I think, part of your strength that you can bring such health to the people who come to you for their hearing care. So, you know, these were made for on-stage ear monitors, but I mean, I use them for everyday life. You know, now more and more people are using architectural features to enhance sound the way you were showing with the Bose device. And so, again, this is another one of my students, Kelly Tremblay. I don't know if you've heard of her. She is a professor at the University of Washington, and she created an app which is called I Hear You, and it is a crowd informed app that basically, if you go to different cities, you can figure out where can I go, where's a quiet place, where's a moderately quiet place, where's a loud place. You sometimes want to have a loud place. And you can get information about ambient noise, and you can contribute by just downloading this app and not only benefiting from other people's entries, but putting in your own. Noise exposure and your profession. So this is important. I'll tell you another story about my son. This is my baby son, who was driving a car, and he was complaining that it sounded like his transmission was failing. Like he was just getting these sounds that just didn't sound right. And he brought his car to two different mechanics who are really, really great mechanics, know a lot about cars. And they took his car around, and they said, you know, no problem. Your car's fine. So he kept driving it, and eventually the transmission went out, and he realized the mechanics they couldn't hear it. They couldn't hear it. And, you know, and yet this is their job, right? So I want you to think about, this is conceptual now. And I'm just about done. But this idea of sound processing, so auditory processing and your experience. So the more you do something, the languages you speak, the music you make, the noise you listen to, whatever you do a lot for many years will have a big impact on sound processing. Everybody's always worried and interested in what's happening in the moment. How can I maximize my sound processing right here and now? And yes, that's important, but people lose sight of the fact that you're maximizing sound processing in a system, in a brain, that has a long history, okay? So both of these things are important. So let's think about the fact that we have a pathway, an afferent pathway that connects our ear to our brain. And I started, remember this morning? Whew, felt like days ago. Telling you about the pathways that come downstairs, the efferent pathways, which incidentally are more numerous than the ones that go upstairs. And they hugely inform how it is that we hear, because it takes into account our cognitive, our sensory motor, our reward, our experiences with sound. So think about the afferent pathway as being a very stable, automatic, default pathway. And that is one that is very, very solid and is based on our experience through sound. Again, think about Ravi Krishnan and his tone language speakers. These are people who had made sound to meaning connections so that they could pick up these little dips in frequency changes automatically. So think, I mean, when you do things enough, your basic afferent system down to your ear has memory. You know, why are your otoacoustic emissions different based on your musical experience? So all along the pathway, when you do things again and again and again, things change. And it's not especially plastic online in the moment. Over time it is. Then you have this efferent pathway, the brain-to-ear pathway, which is largely something that is more malleable and will fade quickly. So this is, you know, the things that we do once, twice, 3 times, and eventually if we don't do it a lot, it will fade. But if we do it again and again, then it becomes the new input pathway, the new automatic input pathway that your brain will perceive whether you are asleep or awake. And so, you know, you have these ear-to-brain, brain-to-ear pathways, and so with experience, the afferent processes change to a new default state. And online processing and the effects of attention, relatively, you know, this is small. So just know that the things that you spend a lot of time doing and hearing are going to have a profound effect on the person that you become and on the person that you'll treat. So biologically, we are what we do. And how well our brains process sound ingredients very much are affected by what we do. And the idea, I think, here is to harness sound processing in the brain to inform what you do, which is to provide hearing health care. And you know, I think this is a very exciting time, and you know, I think this is a time to embrace the changes that are coming, because I think little by little people are appreciating this silent, invisible, not silent, this invisible sense of hearing. And it has become more important to people. And people are becoming more discriminating in terms of what they want to be able to hear and not hear. And you are there to be able to be a personal trainer for people. I mean, you know, you can have all these little apps and devices. I mean, I go to the gym and people have all these little thingies that measure everything, and that's a signal to noise problem. You know, oh, I can do this, I can measure that, but does anybody ever use any of it? And it can be very distracting. But if you have a good trainer who is looking at you and is looking at how you're moving and certain aspects of your physical function and gives you feedback and knows what are your priorities. You know, do you want to look buff or do you want to have stamina, or both? You know, and now I think you have more and more to work with, and you know, I think this is a very exciting time and a really important time for audiologists and hearing health care providers to really have an impact on people's lives in the world. Here are our wonderful Brain Volts crowd again, our magical website, and I thank you.
Thank you again for another great presentation. I think there might be some questions, and if you do, please give me a signal so I can give you a microphone. Any questions yet? Here's one question.
I always have questions.
Good.
Nina, so fascinating again. One of my questions, I'll leave the rest for the others, is when you were talking about bilingual speech and noise disadvantage, does the type of language matter? So whether it's a Germanic language or a Latin language, or not really?
So the person who can really answer that probably best of all is Anne Bradlow, who is a linguist who has studied many, many different languages and hearing and noise. The hearing and noise advantages and disadvantages is not something that has been studied very much. So we have information actually in rather disparate languages, so in tonal languages and also in more Germanic languages. But I think we have insufficient information to know how pervasive it is and how important, there are huge differences, as you know, between informational masking and energetic masking, right? So if you understand the language, or if it's similar to the one you speak, you will have informational masking on top of the energetic masking. I guess I will put to you that this is an area that I think is a very important one. Most of the world is bilingual, at least. And we need to understand more about the bilingual brain and how it processes sounds and sounds in noise. There are very, very few studies right now on that, maybe 10, 15 studies. That's not really very many. There's a lot of information on bilinguals' ability to pay attention to important things, to ignore distractors. Some of these cognitive advantages have been repeated over and over and over again. And a lot of the advantages have been shown in the visual system, that if you are looking at competing visual items and you have to pull out the target. Again, they've shown again and again that bilinguals have advantages. These are non-linguistic tasks. When you have the auditory system and now you start putting in the whole linguistic nature of things, things become more complicated. And I think it's clear that the bilingual brain deals with noise differently. And I think we need to understand more about it. Yeah.
I think it's very interesting that musicians have this hearing and noise advantage. But my personal experience, and also from research literature, you found that musicians are often very noise sensitive, and that hyperacusis and also tinnitus and other noise-related things are very common in musicians. And also, most musicians that I know will not have on the radio in the background or any kind of background noise in their own houses. They will try to limit, and they are not fans of music, and because they feel that their mind is always tuned into making sense of the sound around them, and so elevator music is just so unnerving.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And there's also, and something that you know about with, if you're spending a lot of time in sound. And I know I feel this when I'm visiting my sons in New York City. When I come home, I just want quiet. So And the idea also, so you know, my husband's a musician, and they're pretty cognizant of, you know, and they play loud music, and they will play for, you know, an hour or so, and they realize that it really helps to take a break, give it a rest, and they'll, you know, do something else, and it'll be quiet for a while before they resume again. But yes, people with musical training often are very keen and sensitive to sounds. Really?
Any more questions?
Is everything clear? No questions?
I guess you made it clear.
Or something?
Tell you what, when you had your first presentation, I was starting to think, I don't know exactly when, but why my kids don't listen to me.
Mhm.
And then you started talking about the birds, and I was thinking, why doesn't my dog listen to me?
Mhm.
And of course, I have to ask myself, why doesn't my wife listen to me? And she's trilingual, and we have a noisy home, and her sister is trying to become a professional boxer. So then I almost broke down, so I thought I should keep this chocolate. But I'll give it to you anyway.
Oh,
Now, thank you very much for 2 great speeches.
Thank you.
And it was really nice having you here.
Thank you. Thank you for the chocolate. Thank you for your attention.